Good afternoon. Wow, what a great turnout on a rainy day. So thank you all very much for being here. My name is Larry Thiel. I'm the director of the Global Affairs Center. Today's topic is the relationship between Japan and China and what it means for other countries. These two countries have a long history of animosity and conflict toward each other, but they also have a lot in common, such as energy and environmental concerns. So the question is, will the relationship in this century, the 21st century, be a peaceful one, or will it be marked by old and new conflicts? And with us to discuss these two rising Asian powers is Sam Shepard, here to my right. Mr. Shepard is a senior advisor at Associates in Cultural Exchange, a language and cultural training organization. He'll correct anything I'm saying about it in his first remarks, that he helped establish, I believe, in 1973. He was president of the National Association of Japan America Societies, located in Washington, D.C., from 2004 to 2009. He was the executive director or the CEO of the Fulbright program in Tokyo, Japan, from 1994 to 2004. So he spent a lot of time in Japan, and he's pretty familiar with the region, I think. So please join me in welcoming him to this discussion. Thank you. Okay. So the way the format's going to work is we're going to chat for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to maybe less, and then we want to be sure we leave a lot of time for questions from the audience. So let's get started. Sam, how about briefly telling us about your experience in Japan and China, and you can correct anything that I just said.
I'm Sam Shepard, and it's great to be here. Always fun to be with a group of students, as well as people interested in Asia. I've spent a good part of my life in Asia, and I have academic training about Asia. My master's is in Asian Studies, where we looked fairly deeply into the connection between mostly the East Asian countries, China, Japan, and Korea. I've lived a good part of my life in Asia, mostly in Japan, but also in Korea. In my work in international education, I've traveled extensively in China, as well as other parts of Asia. And so, again, I've been lucky in being able to follow, my strengths. I thank my parents daily for the privilege of having grown up in another culture, namely Japan. I spent most of my first 19 years in Japan. Spent 2 years in the Peace Corps in the early 70s in Korea, South Korea. And I never thought that I would get into a field that took me back to Asia necessarily, but that's the way it happened, and I consider it a real privilege. And again, it's always good to be in an educational environment. Spent much of my career in higher education, and look forward to today's comments. We'll be chatting back and forth here, as Larry said. I also want to thank Larry for this opportunity and for Shoreline to open its doors. I live about 3 minutes down the street here. Been on campus many times. Look forward to the day.
Okay, thank you very much. So, I guess this is a pretty broad question, so you can take it any way that you're comfortable with. But how would you characterize the relationship between Japan and China today?
Well, that's a pretty easy one because it's not very good, quite frankly. It's pretty rocky. I think that for a few years now there have been incidents and so on between the two countries that have made the relationship kind of rough. I think probably I would agree with observers, I being one of them, they would say that many of the things that are happening right now are somewhat on the surface, that what drives the differences between the two countries, quite frankly, is because and a rather naturally evolving sort of tensions between the two countries, is that they both have ambitions in Asia, and they're both countries with very strong economies and are dominant in Asia economically. The way it's surfaced, of course, in the last few years is from the Chinese point of view. Japan and the Japanese government, and perhaps they would say the people too, have not really confronted the past, and particularly World War II. I'm at an age when I talk about the war, I always mean World War II, but I realize you have to be careful with that these days because there have been several since then. But when I say the war, in this case, it's World War II. And of course, on the Asia side, what drove many countries and brought them into the war was a fairly aggressive military stance on the part of the Japanese government, which by that time, in the early 40s, the latter 30s, was dominated by the military. And after World War II, Japan got involved in its economic drive and really focused on that. And for a lot of different reasons, some people would say it's kind of characteristic of the Japanese people to, when something happens and something bad happens, you move on, you don't dwell on it. And that's exactly what the Japanese people did after World War II. They just moved on, more or less accepted the dominance of the United States early on after World War II, after their defeat with MacArthur and the military government in Japan, the occupation, as we say. And during that time, China, of course, was having its preoccupations in moving into a completely different government through the communist takeover of China. Prior to that, of course, there had been battles among different groups in China, but ultimately Mao Zedong and others took over China. So these kinds of historical things really, help drive the situation in between and put, in a sense, a barrier between the two countries. For many years, actually, in the 70s and 80s, there was a pretty good relationship between the two countries. They continued to have delegations going back and forth. In 1972, Japan recognized China and vice versa. But in recent years, because of internal process in Japan and what was going on there, getting back to the specific question that Larry asked, it's been a bit grim, with each side claiming the other has not been really up to speed. And I was just explaining to a certain extent why that has evolved. And in recent years, there are three things that have been particularly central to the exacerbation of the relationships between the two countries. One is visits by the Prime Minister to Yasukuni Shrine. Another is skirmishes and disagreements over the islands of in Chinese, Diaoyu Islands, and in Japanese, the Senkaku Islands. Those have been, nobody even knew about those islands until rather recently. But somehow they've become central to the discussions between the two countries. And the other is from the Chinese point of view, Japan has become more aggressive. Not so much aggressive, I guess, as China senses that Japan is starting to build up its military again. From the Japan side, they're saying, let's move on. It's been 70 years since World War II, after all. How long can we continue to talk about World War II? It's in the past. Let's move along. Prime Minister Abe and others who have visited the Yasukuni Shrine are saying that's simply honoring those who have died for their country. All countries do that. And in terms of building up the military, Prime Minister Abe would say that they're simply normalizing their military after many years of calling it the self-defense force and not really recognizing it as a true military. They're simply normalizing the military, and there's really nothing to worry about. And as I alluded to earlier, it really is much more complicated than these issues, because both countries are still modernizing their economy, their military, and so on. And I would agree, again, with many who say that their underlying tensions are really are structural, and it's because both countries are trying to increase their influence in Asia and be sort of dominant. In recent days, literally, however, and in trying to read the tea leaves, there have been some good signs. And I suppose that the mere fact that Prime Minister Lee, or Premier Lee, and Prime Minister Abe shook hands at a recent conference, and the fact that that makes big news is an indication of just how troubled the relationship has been and is. But just yesterday, former Prime Minister Fukuda actually met with President Xi of China, and actually spent several minutes talking with one another, and both came out of that saying that it was a positive meeting. And so there's a chance, in fact, most observers now say that within the next month or so, at the APEC conference, that is the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Conference, that President Xi and Prime Minister Abe will in fact be meeting. This has not been publicly announced by either government, but I think the chances look very good that the two will be able to meet and begin talking. Another good sign, and this is also within the last few days, is maybe I should explain a little bit about Yasukuni, and I'd be happy to talk about this more later if anybody wants me to expand on it, but it's a Shinto shrine that was set aside from the beginning as a place to honor those who have died, in particular the military. And where it has gotten controversial is that there are 14 Japanese military leaders who were convicted in the post-war, immediately after the war, as war criminals. And many of them were executed. And these are also memorialized at Yasukuni Shrine. And when that happened was when there began to be a lot more focus on Yasukuni Shrine. And just recently, there's a strong association called the War Bereaved Families Association, in Japanese Izokukai, in Japan, that has up till now supported having everybody together in Yasukuni Shrine, regardless of whether they were war criminals or not, who just recently, the chapter in Fukuoka has recommended that the 14 war criminals be put in another place. And I think internally, from the Japanese point of view, I would say that's a very good sign. It might not affect current relations, that is in the next few months, but in the more immediate term, could be the beginning of a kind of solution to the dilemma of having war criminals along with others who have been killed. Because I don't think anybody in any country would object to honoring those who have died in war, because all of our countries, unfortunately, have been involved in extensive war in many, many places, and all countries honor their dead. So I would wind up my response to your first question by saying that there's some hopeful signs, if you read the tea leaves, so to speak, for better relations in the immediate future.
Okay, well, thank you. And it's kind of a follow-up to that is, how is it important to other countries, this relationship between Japan and China? That presumes why. I'm not asking why it's important, but how is it important?
Yes. Well, I think that it is important for a couple of maybe rather obvious reasons, and that is that China has historically, been very dominant in Asia. During its preoccupation initially with Mao Zedong's policies to communize China and some of his efforts, there was a lot of internal focus and very little focus outside the country. But prior to that and since then, and increasingly, of course, China is dominant in Asia and will become increasingly so. So all of the countries, for one, around China, whether you talk about the Philippines or Vietnam, Thailand, are affected by what China does and its policies. And Japan, as well, is a dominant Asian country economically. And U.S. and Japan have very close relationships, and the United States, in fact, is a dominant Asia-Pacific power. That's a given. And with extensive military, of course, bases still in Japan and in other parts of Asia. So inevitably, the United States and other countries are keenly interested in the relationship between Japan and China, because they are the two economic superpowers, in a sense, in Asia right now.
Okay. There was a recent survey, and I think it was in a Chinese newspaper, the South China Morning Post. It found that a majority of citizens in both countries, China and Japan, have an unfavorable impression of the other country, and many in the survey, when they were asked, they expect that there will be some kind of conflict between the countries in the near future. In your opinion, how significant are these findings?
Well, I think they're significant in that they tell us about Japan and tell us about what Japan is doing and how the people feel, how the Chinese people feel. These polls have been taken for a long time, as I understand it, and they're unfavorable on both sides. They underscore the negative feelings, unfortunately, on both sides. But they are volatile, and it depends heavily on domestic media that tends to paint negative pictures of each other. I mean, our perception of other countries, unfortunately, is very strongly influenced by media. And in both countries, China and Japan, the domestic media dominate the information that one receives about outside countries. So if you have 80–90% of your media, domestic media, talking negatively about the other country, inevitably the opinion polls become negative. It's a vicious cycle, and it's quite unfortunate. However, to kind of counteract that, there are people-to-people exchanges that continue, and people generally may be surprised, at least if you're not Japanese, that there are 81,000 Chinese students studying in Japanese universities from 2013 statistics. That's out of 135 international students, so way over half of the international students And I visit universities in Japan quite a bit, and virtually every university in Japan that has international students, the dominant student numbers are from China. So there's a lot of interaction going on. I just got back from Okinawa and was staying in a hotel where it seemed like half the people in the hotel were from China. And so you have a lot of exchange going on at that level, and you certainly don't see people that, you know, with animosity. A lot of friendships among international students, the Chinese and the Japanese, as well as other international students in Japan. So yes, the polls measure one aspect of it, but it's not completely accurate in terms of a lot of other things that are going on.
Okay. We've been talking about sort of conflict between the countries. I want to talk a little bit about cooperation, because Japan and China are both Asian cultures. So in that regard, what do they have in common in a positive sense?
Well, some people have, when talking about the relationship between the two countries, and I would include myself in this as well, is that they've had thousands of years, actually, of quite close relationship. And it's only in the last 50 years or 60 years that this relationship has gone askew with the militarism and with other things that have happened between the two countries. And so, for starters, in the 8th century, during the Tang Dynasty in China and during Shotoku Taishi, Prince Shotoku's reign in Japan, a lot of exchanges were going on between Japan and the United States, and in fact, there was an extraordinary infusion of Chinese institutional codes and other things that came into Japan during the 8th century. This includes the writing system, legal law codes, not to mention the religion itself of Buddhism, and the philosophy of Confucianism. These were heavy influences from China. And the exchanges and the trips and so on that scholars and priests and others would make continued throughout the years between China and Japan. So, interestingly enough, you know, the writing system, as certainly those of you from Japan know, but others may not, is the writing system in Japan is based on the Chinese characters. They still use Chinese characters in Japan. But there was nothing natural about this. There was no more reason to use Chinese characters for Japanese than there would be for English to have adopted Chinese characters for English. The two are not related. Chinese is a tonal language with a completely different linguistic history. Japanese is not a tonal language, along with Korean. But yet it borrowed the Chinese characters and developed their own syllabary and so on from the Chinese characters, and now use 3 different scripts, all originally based on the Chinese script, Chinese characters. So the influence is extraordinary. Not to mention Confucianism, with the social order in Confucianism. The respect for elders, the whole bureaucracy system that was developed by China was incorporated into the Japanese system. So the influences from China to Japan are really quite extraordinary. And among Japanese in general, there is no denial of that. I mean, it's always been accepted. And there is, I think, underlying respect on the part of Japanese for that kind of cultural dominance on the part of China, and recognition that has happened. So there's been this thousands of years of exchange in arts and music, and if you look at Japanese art, the influence from Chinese art is really quite striking. So this thousands of years of exchange, or hundreds of years of exchange, and respect for one another hopefully will not be disrupted, or has been disrupted briefly, but hopefully that will help drive, the relationship in the future.
Okay, let's see if we've got some questions in the audience. And you're welcome to, Drew, can you come up here and grab the microphone? Thank you. You can ask your question directly yourself, but if you do that, we ask that you use a microphone just because we are recording this event and we pick up the sound better. Or if you prefer, there's a card in your program and you can write the question down on the card and raise your hand, and we will come around and grab the cards. So, does anyone like want to start? Any questions out there? Right here.
Hi, my name is Mayumi Steinmetz, and I teach Japanese language and history here. Thank you so much for the information, and it's been really educational. The question that I have is, so the Japanese respected Chinese culture and adopted Chinese civilization in their own way, and for longest time, in a way, Japan was, in a way, like a subject of China, and so, or little brother of China, but after the World War II, and with the American government help, Japan climbed up in the economical system. And so now, and meanwhile, China, under the Communist Party, China kind of was not looking towards the world. So now China sort of like waking up, and so now Japan was acting like a older brother, and so how can their role in the world can be like negotiated in a peaceful way for the future?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. I think that in the immediate steps to do that are not particularly easy. I mean, again, in my initial remarks, I mentioned that there's some good signs right now, that there may be some dialogue going on, but I think that each side needs to pull back, and that's not necessarily an easy thing to do. I mean, I think that the broader context of having people go back and forth will probably continue, and that should continue. Education is always a great way, in my opinion. Study abroad for Japanese students, and we have a handful here, I understand, probably some Chinese students and other international students here. I've always been a huge advocate of study abroad, and that certainly can be a piece of that, getting to know each other. I mean, you can't demonize someone usually if you know them, and that's unfortunately what's happening here in many ways, is each side, through its domestic politics and domestic activity, often demonizes the other one, and the more we can get away from that, the better. But I think that the governments do, if I had my hope, what I would hope is that on the Japan side, that Prime Minister Abe, would go public and say that, okay, for the next few years, I am not going to visit Yasukuni. Not because he doesn't have a right to do that. As an individual, he has a right to do that. And I think there are many people who understand why he does that. I mean, he talks about doing it to recognize that war is bad and peace is good. But clearly, that is an issue with China. So that's an instance where I think where Prime Minister Abe would be appreciated and respected for taking the bold step of saying, okay, I know this bothers the government of China or the people of China, so I will go public and just say I will not go to Yasukuni for the next few years. On on the Chinese side, of course, they need to do something as well, and for them, probably pulling back from some of the military skirmishes and activity around the disputed islands and some things like that would have a very significant effect toward Japan. So I would say that those kinds of things. Again, getting back to education, up until 2006, there were textbook committees that would go back and forth, look at each other's textbooks and share those textbooks. And of course, through textbooks is another way, besides the media, how impressions of a country are disseminated. How we treat people in the United States through our textbooks and how we talk about them in world history and so on has an impact. The same is true of Japan and the United States. How do the Chinese textbooks treat Japanese or Japan, and vice versa? And the answer, unfortunately, is probably not very well. But if those are shared, if the governments would be, and in both cases, Japanese and Chinese education is highly centralized, to the extent that most Americans have a hard time understanding how education could be so centralized, but it is in Japan and it is in the United States. And if the respective ministries of education would say, let's bring the Chinese textbooks into Japan and share them with the Japanese so they can understand how Japan is being treated and vice versa. Also continue the dialogue between Japan and the United States on the textbooks and how perhaps they can correct some of the misinformation. One would hope, of course, that it would lead eventually to a more positive view of the two countries. Face-saving ways, to begin dialogues, I think would certainly be important.
Question here?
Thank you. The recent tension between Japan and China has sort of got both the military in both countries on alert, let's say. How has this affected the relationship between American and Japanese military? I know there's been a lot of controversy over the U.S. base in Okinawa. Has the rise in tension between Japan and China had an effect on that military relationship between the U.S.?
Oh, I think it has, probably in different ways. I think that as probably most people here know, the United States and Japan have a very strong military relationship. There's constant and of course treaty agreements to defend. The United States has strong commitments to defend Japan in the case of any kind of attack. So when military activity from China begins to threaten that, then it heightens tensions, I think, between the U.S. and China. I think the United States would very much wants the relationship between Japan and China to become normalized. I can tell you that the problem of the Yasukuni Shrine does not make the U.S. government happy. And there's been subtle and not so subtle, hints that Japan needs to sort of clean this up. I think that from the U.S. standpoint, the transition that is going on too within Japan, in terms of its government, in terms of the realignment maybe of its military, also forces a number of questions about the U.S.-Japan Military Security Pact. This gets fairly involved and complicated, but if as China in China's interpretation, the rise of the Japanese military, they are concerned about what they perceive as the rise of the Japanese military or militarism. I don't perceive that. I don't think that there is a rise in Japanese militarism. I think it's a shift in emphasis. It is partially a process of normalization of the Japanese military. Every country has a military. The only country in the world that has denounced the military, I think, is Guatemala. And they have a police force, but they have said they're not going to have a military. But every other country, clearly, they call it a military. In Japan, this has always been an issue since World War II. Some look at that, many Japanese look at these moves because it's in the Constitution. There is reference to not having a military. So thus the development of a self-defense force. Prime Minister Abe, I believe, wants to change that in the Constitution. And there are many Japanese who look at that nervously. Not just people from outside or the United States. There's many in the government, many observers on the American side who would say that that's a normalization of the military. So it's not really a big deal. But getting back to your question, I think that all of these tensions just exacerbate the whole context of the U.S.-Japan relationship, as well as the relationship between the U.S. and Japan and so on.
Any other questions out there?
Would you say, like you were mentioning how the Japan-China relations were pretty stable until around 70 years ago? Would you say that it was the outside influences from other countries that caused the destabilization? Like influences from America and other countries pulling on the ideals of Japan and China?
No, I think to be blunt, it was the rise of the Japanese militarists that caused a great divide between China and Japan, because the Japanese military in the 30s began invading China. And prior to that, they had defeated China in a skirmish, that didn't lead immediately into war between Japan and the U.S., because there was a time in the 20s and that there was sort of a blossoming of democracy in Japan with roots in the 19th century, and it was moving in a good direction. But then, for a lot of internal, rather complicated reasons, the extreme right and militarists began to take over. And I would say that it was, that was the beginning of the end of good relationships between Japan and China. During World War II, or prior to World War II, the Japanese military basically took over Manchuria and other parts of China. So that, of course, didn't sit well. And then the devastation so it's, no, I wouldn't. What I was trying to do is to sort of put into context. If you look at 2,000 years of contact between Japan and China, only the last 100 have been rough, and maybe out of that, the last 50, 60 have been really rough. But I think, that the cause of that was the militarists in Japan leading up to and during World War II.
Other questions?
Would you talk some more about the dispute over the islands, and including Korea's role in that?
Yeah.
And can you hazard a guess as to where that may eventually be resolved, perhaps?
Well, again, I would say that the underlying issue here is not so much the islands, but a more structural one in which China is trying to increase its dominance in that area. It's a excuse in many ways with the Senkaku Island dispute, for instance, around Taiwan. I mean, the islands are worthless. Unfortunately, the Korean issue is different because they're different islands. It's not really, and that sort of gets off into a whole different. I mean, there again, you have rising expectations on the part of Korea and Japan, and historically, that's kind of a different issue. I don't, with Korea, I don't see them all that preoccupied with establishing hegemony over, to be dominant in Asia. I think that for China, that's one of the underlying structural reasons why it's making a big deal out of that. And it's kind of pushing the envelope. It's getting to the point now where it actually can be described as dangerous because of the back and forth. Now, one thing that excuse me, from my perspective, China completely misunderstood, if I may go so far, is a few years ago, there were some private individuals, one of them being the mayor of Tokyo, who got all worked up about the Senkaku Islands and said that he was get some private individuals together and buy the island. The Japanese government stepped in with I think appropriate intentions, which was they thought if they went in and the government bought the island, that would diffuse the situation and focus it more on between the U.S. the two governments. Instead of that, the Chinese government interpreted that very negatively and continued to do so. So some of that has been, I think, a misunderstanding on the part of what the intentions of the other. But I think what exacerbates it is China, frankly, is pushing the envelope because it wants to establish hegemony in areas that it had historically been dominant. I mean, as far as the legal nature of that, just to add a word, that gets rather complicated. But in the last, what, I can't remember I didn't go back and review this, but in the last, certainly since the war and prior to the war, Japan has held those islands, and there was no dispute. It's fairly recently that has come back into dispute.
As you mentioned that there's a lot of international students Chinese students in Japan, and I'm thinking about Japan population is getting older and older, while Chinese population is growing. So is there a flow of workforce from China to Japan, and how do Chinese workers contribute to the Japanese economy in terms of physical labor or in Japanese business corporation? Thank you.
That's a very good question. I might just add before that there are 24,000 Japanese studying in China. It's not the largest like the reverse is. The largest number, can you guess what the largest number of international students in China? From what country? South Korea, actually.
Really?
Yeah, there's something like, what was it? I was kind of startled by it. There are 63,000 South Koreans studying in China. And North Korea was not on there, but maybe they weren't listed for some reason. I don't know. But North Korea wasn't even on there. They may not have the freedom to study in China. The U.S. was 24,000. But getting back to your question about the, very good question, about the influence of the, at least the way I took your question was, with all the Chinese students in Japan, how has that influenced the relationship, and what, in a sense, what did they do after they graduate? Most of them returned to China. So there's not a whole lot of influx, somewhat unfortunately for China, because the labor issue in Japan is critical. And there are basically two solutions. One is to get more women involved in the workforce, and the other is to invite immigrants to Japan. There are, of course, cases where Japanese have stayed in, Chinese have stayed in Japan, and there are workers in the service industries in Japan. They did not necessarily stay in Japan after they graduated. They came through service industry visas and so on, and stay in Japan with maybe the intention of wanting to go on to college. But most Chinese students return to China after. Now, a good question there would be, since the Chinese students I've talked to in Japan most have a pretty good image of Japan and have friends in Japan. So what happens when they return to China? I'm sorry, I don't have, it would be an interesting research project to find out exactly what the impact of all the Chinese, because this has been going on for years. You know, the dominance of Chinese international students has been that way for what, over 10 years, maybe 20 years. So there are thousands and thousands of Chinese students who have returned to China. Very good question. Maybe that would be a good research project for you.
There you go. We have time for one more question. Student right here.
Yeah, my question pertains to, I don't believe there were comments, but there was a decision on the part of the Abe government, I think it was to not revise an apology vis-a-vis the use of comfort women during World War II, which made, I think caused a lot of controversy, particularly in Korea. And, you know, that combined with the textbook controversy, I've seen occasional Japanese politicians make statements about that are very controversial. And I suppose this is a difficult question to answer. How does that affect Japanese society as a whole? If you were to ask the average Japanese person, how would they feel about that?
Well, that would be an interesting question for some of the Japanese in the audience to answer, perhaps. Fortunately, or more unfortunately, I'm not sure that the average Japanese is preoccupied with that question, I think would be the honest, brutal answer to that. It's not that nobody cares, but I think, again, from the Japanese, particularly young people's perspective, this is 70 years ago, and it's easy to gloss over it for a number of reasons, part of which is militaries do that all the time. You know, wherever militaries go, there are prostitutes outside the gates, and sometimes militaries actively recruit prostitutes. I would prefer not to name the other countries, but there are countries involved in fairly recent wars that brought their own, you know, prostitutes into the country. That doesn't excuse the involvement, but there's also controversy about exactly how all that happened and who was involved and was the military directly involved. And the objective research I've read is that, yes, I think probably the Japanese military was involved in some way. Another thing that I might add to this is that adds to the climate right now, including an explanation for why Abe sometimes makes the moves that he does, is that I think there are many Japanese young people who either, World War II is a long ways away and don't really care, and plus the fact that there have been apologies before, both about the war effort as well as the comfort women. I didn't bring them with me, but there's a whole string actually of apologies on the part of the Japanese government. That the emotional level says, let's get on with this. Why do we have to keep repeating our apologies? So whether this is right or wrong, I think the general feeling, which in some ways Prime Minister Abe represents, is we're tired of being kicked around. Again, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but that's the general feeling of I would say, many Japanese. And that's why the polls would indicate that Abe is strongly supported by the majority of Japanese people when he goes to Yasukuni Shrine and so on. It's about time we stood up for ourselves. Now, whether that's helpful in terms of relationships with China and Korea, obviously it's not. But I would say that that's the feeling I get. Having spent a lot of time in Japan and just got back from Japan, that it's controversial and that not everybody here who is familiar with Japan or Japanese would necessarily agree with me, but that's my perception.
All right, before I close the program, are there any Japanese citizens in the room that have something to say about that last question of attitudes in Japan toward these things of a distant past? Or, no? All right. Well, then, let's please join me in giving a round of applause to Mr. Shepard for being with us here today.